Good morning, friends, and welcome back to Learning with Mrs. Preby. Today we are working on Fairytales, Lesson 7, Hansel and Gretel, Part 2. Today's learning goal says, I can orally compare and contrast similarities and differences between the witch in Hansel and Gretel and the witch in Rapunzel. So yesterday we were reading the story of Hansel and Gretel, and I'm just trying to remember how this story started. I do remember this was the woodcutter and his wife and the children, and that they're hungry and there isn't enough food. And the wife is trying to say, we need to get rid of these children so that we can eat. So in the first part, Hansel laid out the stones. He was collecting the stones so he could put them on the ground here while they're walking them out in the woods so that they don't get lost. And then they managed to, well, here they are. They're leaving them in the woods. And Hansel and Gretel are going to go to sleep. And when they wake up, they're not there, but they can follow the stones back home. And then the stepmother comes up with another plan to take them further into the woods and leave them out further in the woods. She locks them in the room because she figured out how they managed to find their way back, and she doesn't want them to find their way back. So this time he puts breadcrumbs down. He puts breadcrumbs down so he can find his way back, but the bird had eaten all the breadcrumbs, and he can't find his way back using those breadcrumbs. And I remember they were looking, but they looked for a whole day, and then they could not find their way back. So, think about what's happened so far and what you think might happen in this next part of the fairy tale. So some of you may have already heard a version of this, but if you have already heard this story, then you can listen and see how this version of the story is different than the one you have already seen or similar to it. So what does it mean to be a hero? Let's see. As I recall, we said that a hero is brave, and a good man or a boy, and a heroine is brave and a good woman or a girl. And someone who is heroic is very brave and daring and good. Can you think of someone who is a hero or a heroine and describe to those people in your room with you what it makes them heroic? Right now, with today's times and most of us at home because of the COVID-19 virus, I would have to say that I believe all our first responders, our EMTs, our nurses, our doctors, all of them are heroic and brave because they express the fear and concern that they might actually get the virus, but then they still go to work and they still take care of those around us who are getting ill. So they're my heroes and heroines for now. Okay, listen carefully to find out whether or not your predictions are correct about what might happen in this next part of the fairy tale. So also listen carefully to decide if any of these characters in Hansel and Gretel are heroic or evil. We want to think about the witch in Rapunzel and the witch that we're going to see today, according to our learning goal, and think about how they're similar or different from each other. Okay. It was now the third morning since they had left their father's house. They started along again, always looking for the way home, but instead only going deeper into the forest. Unless help came soon, they would surely starve. At about noon they saw a pretty snow-white bird sitting on a branch and singing so beautiful that they stopped to listen. Then the bird spread its wings and flew before them, as though to say, "Follow me." And so the children followed the bird until they came to a little house. The bird flew up and perched on the roof. To perch is to stand on a high spot. And then the children saw the walls of the house were made of gingerbread, and the roof was made of cake, and the windows were made of clear sugar candy. What do you think Hansel and Gretel are going to do next? Let's eat, cried Hansel. Hansel reached up and broke off a piece of the candy, while Gretel chewed on the piece of the wall. Suddenly they heard a thin, screechy woman's voice. A thin voice is weak and not very loud. Call out from inside the house. Nimble, nimble like a mouse, who's nibbling at my house? The children answered, It's only the air heaving a sigh. It's only the wind passing by. Hansel and Gretel are trying to convince the woman she only hears wind making sound. The children were so hungry they went on eating. But then the door opened and a very old woman came out, leaning on a cane. Hansel and Gretel were so frightened that they dropped the food from their hands. But the old woman just nodded her head and said, My dear little children, what has brought you here? Come inside and stay with me. I'll take good care of you. Do you think Hansel and Gretel should go inside? Would you go inside? So she took them by the hand and led them into her little house. There they found a wonderful meal of hot pancakes with honey and nuts and apples and cold milk. After that, the old woman showed them 2 little white beds, and Hansel and Gretel laid down and wondered if they were just dreaming. Do you think that maybe they're dreaming? Now, the old woman seemed kind, but in fact she was a wicked witch. Wicked means very bad or mean. The story goes that she built her house just to trap little children, and once she had them, she would cook them and eat them. Do you think this is an example of fantasy? Yes, there aren't really witches who eat children. She could not see well, but she had an excellent sense of smell. Earlier in the day, she had sniffed Hansel and Gretel coming near. The next morning, before the children were awake, the witch got up and looked at their rosy cheeks. What a fine meal I will have, she cackled. To cackle means to laugh in a loud way. So it sounded like this. What a fine meal I will have. She got Hansel out of bed and put him in a cage. Then she went back and woke up Gretel and shouted, Get up, you lazy bones! Fetch water, cook something nice for your brother. Feed him well, for once he's nice and fat, I will eat him. Who else called the children lazy bones? Yeah, the stepmother. Gretel screamed and cried, but it was no use. She had to do what the wicked witch said. Day after day she cooked pots full of rich food for Hansel, while she herself ate nothing but crumbs. Rich foods are heavy and full of fat to fill them up. Rich also means to have a lot of money. Every morning the wicked witch would creep to the cage and say, Hansel, stick out your fingers so I can tell if you are plump enough to cook. Creep means move forward silently and slowly. But clever Hansel held out a little bone that Gretel had given him, and the old woman, who could not see very well, couldn't tell that it wasn't Hansel's finger. She wondered why he wasn't getting any plumper. How did clever Hansel trick the witch? Yeah, by holding out the bone. When 4 weeks passed and Hansel seemed as thin as ever, the witch grew impatient. What does impatient mean? It means that the witch is getting tired of waiting. Hurry up and get a pot of water, she snarled. Be he fat or thin, I'm going to cook him and eat him. Oh no! What do you think's going to happen? As she filled the kettle with water and lit the fire, tears ran down Gretel's cheek. First we will bake, said the old woman. I've heated the oven, and the dough is ready. And then she pushed Gretel towards the oven, where the flames were burning brightly. Stick your head in, the witch said to Gretel, and tell me if it's hot enough for us to bake the bread. But Gretel knew what the witch had in mind. What do you think the witch has in mind? She knew that the witch meant to shut her in the oven and bake her and eat her. So Gretel said, I don't know how to do it. Where do I look? Can you show me how? You silly child, cried the old woman. There's a big opening, don't you see? Why, I could fit in myself. And she stuck her head in the oven. Then Gretel rushed up and with all her might pushed the witch into the oven. She shut the iron door and locked it tight. Gretel ran right to Hansel and let him out of the cage. Come, Hansel, we are free, she cried. The old witch is gone. Hansel sprang out and hugged Gretel, and the children danced for joy and then ran out of the house. Then, because they had nothing to fear, they went back into the witch's house. There they found chests of pearls and precious jewels. These are better than pebbles, laughed Hansel as he filled his pockets, while Gretel filled her apron. Now away we go, said Hansel, and he said quietly, if only we could find our way out of the forest. Where do you think Hansel and Gretel are going? When they had walked a few hours, they came to a wide lake. There's no bridge and no stepping stones, said Hansel. We can't get across. And no boat either, said Gretel. But look, she said, here comes a duck. I will ask her for help. So she called out, Duck, duck, here we stand, Hansel and Gretel on the land. Stepping stones, a bridge we lack. Carry us over on your nice soft back. And lo and behold, the duck came over. Hansel got on her back and told Gretel to sit behind him. Do you think a duck could really take a child or two across a lake? No, not in real life. When they were on the other side of the lake, they walked on for a little while and soon found a path. The forest began to look more and more familiar. At last, in the distance, they saw their father's house. They began to run as fast as they could. They burst through the door and cried out, Father, we're home, and threw themselves into their arms. Do you think their father will be happy to see them? Ever since he had left the children in the forest, the man had been worried sick. As for his mean wife, he told the children she was gone. Now he hugged his children as though he would never let them go. As he squeezed Gretel to him, the pearls and jewels fell from Gretel's apron. Then Hansel reached out into his pockets and pulled out handfuls after handfuls of treasures. They were together again. Their troubles were over, and they lived in perfect happiness for a long, long time. Were your predictions about what happened in this part of the story correct? That I can't tell you. I don't think I knew it was going to end this way. But I knew it was a fairy tale. So I think, yeah, I'm pretty sure I could say that it was going to end happily ever after. Because it was a fairy tale. In the beginning of part 2, Hansel and Gretel are lost in the woods. How do they end up finding the old woman's house? Yeah, they followed the white bird. They had stopped to hear singing, and the bird perched itself on top of the roof. Describe the outside of the old woman's house. Yes, the walls were made of gingerbread, the roof was made of cake, and the windows were made of clear sugar candy. Why is our house made of these things? The woman is a wicked witch who tries to trick children into coming into her house so that she could eat them. Do you think if you walked around out in the woods, you would find a house that was covered in candy or made out of cake? No. So, do you think it's a good idea to be talking to strangers? No, I don't think that's the right thing to do. What new problem do Hansel and Gretel have after arriving at the woman's house? She tells them she plans to eat them. Do you think what happens in this fairy tale could really happen, or is it mostly make believe? Or maybe fantasy? How do you know? Most of the story is fantasy. The wicked witches, no, they don't really exist. People don't eat children. Children cannot ride on ducks. Houses cannot be made out of candy and cake. Okay, so a lot of it's fantasy. What does Gretel do to trick the witch once she realizes the witch is planning to cook her? So she tricks the witch into putting her own head in the oven. That's when Gretel pushes the witch into the oven. What do the children do once the wicked witch is gone? Yes, they take the pearls and precious jewels they found in the witch's house with the help of a duck. They cross the lake and then they find their way home. Do you think of any of the characters in Hansel and Gretel as heroic? So, if you do, which ones are heroic? I think Gretel was very heroic when she pushed the witch into the oven. And I think Hansel is heroic because he is looking for solutions to problems, and though things can be bad, he manages to find their way home, and he okay, just wipe this whole question out, please, Jason. All the way back to where I asked if they think that any of the characters are heroic. So in this read aloud, you heard, every morning the wicked witch would creep into Hansel's cage. Say the word creep. Creep means to move slowly and quietly. When a cat comes in late at night, when my cat comes in late at night, she will creep into the corners so we don't notice her. So I would like you to creep around your room. Pause the video and do some creeping. Did you creep? That was fun. Okay, now I would like you to slither around the room. Go ahead, pause the video, do some slithering. Did you slither? Okay, now I would like you to sneak around the room. Pause the video, go ahead and sneak. Very good, did you sneak? Alright, now I would like you to tiptoe around the room. Go ahead, pause the video and tiptoe. Good job. Did you do some tiptoeing? I bet you did. All right, let's take a look at the chart we've been working on for this. And when we talked about Hansel and Gretel, we said that the story takes place in a deep, dark forest. Did the setting change? I think it did. I think we could also add the witch's house. Witch's house. And then even Hansel and Gretel's house, right? Hansel and Gretel's house. Oh, Hansel is a capital letter because it's a proper noun. This the part of the setting is when did the story take place? Has this changed? No, it was still a long time ago, right? So our characters, we have the woodcutter, the wife, Hansel and Gretel. Do we have any new characters? Is the witch a real like character or a magical character? She's definitely magical, so we'll put the witch. Witch. The witch. Are there any other characters in this story? I don't really remember seeing any other characters. I don't think there are. All right. So I'm wondering if you can remember what other story, which other fairy tale that we've listened to had a witch in it. So the other story that I can think of that had a witch in it was this one, which was Rapunzel. Rapunzel has a witch in it. So in the story of Rapunzel, he's trying to collect some Rapunzel, and the witch catches him. There she is. Right? What does the witch do? Right? She makes him promise to give her the baby, which she takes the baby, Rapunzel, she names her, and she locks her in the tower, right? And then every day she visits by saying, Rapunzel, Rapunzel, let down your golden hair. And then she climbs up the hair, right? And then she catches the prince, so she takes Rapunzel, she cuts the hair, chop, chop. And then she takes Rapunzel way out into the woods, right? And then the prince is blinded. So, but how is this witch the same or different from the witch in our story today? How is she the same or different from this new witch we have? Let's see if I can find it down here. Did the witch and Rapunzel want to eat the children like this witch wants to eat the children? But in Rapunzel, she didn't want to eat her. She just wanted to keep her as her own, right? So they're not really the same that way. They're different that way. They're both witches, but they both have very different ideas as to what to do with these children. Okay. So in the first part of this story, Hansel and Gretel, there weren't any elements of magic or fantasy. But in this second part, there's a lot of fantasy events, and there's the witch, but some of the fantasy events we've seen, we've already kind of talked about, but the first one was the house, the witch's house was made out of candy. That's definitely a fantasy event. We also talked about the duck, right? The duck carried them across the lake. Remember, I'm not expecting you to be able to read everything that I'm writing down, but it helps me to remember the things we talked about, so when we come back to it later, we can remember these things. So, let's see. I'm trying to think of what else was fantasy. Let's see. Let's go back to the story so I can remember some fantasy events here. So the house being made out of candy. Oh, I don't think that Well, for one thing, there's no witch, but the witch trying to eat children, I pretty much, that's pretty not going to happen. So we can say the witch eating children is a fantasy. Okay? So there was quite a few, I think, in this part. So we talked about in the first half the problems were that the father and the stepmother left them in the woods and they had no food to eat and they got lost. So then the first time they left stones as a path. And then let's see what other kind of. So how do they have food to eat because the house is made of. The house is made of candy. And actually the witch feeds them. So then they're not hungry anymore. They're still lost. Let's see. But what is the problem they have in this second half of the story here? The problem is the witch wants to eat them, right? The witch wants to eat them. Oops. Wants to eat them. That's kind of an issue, right? Let's see. What are some of the solutions that they come up with? So the witch wants to eat them, and at first they're tricking her, right? They tricked her into believing the let me think. BELE. Sorry. They tricked her into thinking that Gretel was not plump. Remember that part? So one of the solutions was that they made her believe that he was not plump. He was too skinny to eat, right? And then Gretel tricks her and pushes her into the oven, right? They trick the witch and push her into the oven. And then part of the solution was the duck carried them across the lake. Oh, that's a lot for this story, right? Kind of got words all over the place. So at the end of this story, what happens? All of this is actually part of the solution, but I ran out of room, so I put it down here. That's okay. At the very end of this story, what happens at the very end? So most fairy tales end with happily ever after. And is this fairy tale ending happily ever after? Yeah, so they live happily ever after. Good. Very good. All right, so let's take a look at this one more time here. I want to go to this page. Here we go. So in this read aloud, you heard day after day, Gretel cooked pots full of rich food for Hansel, while she herself ate nothing but crumbs. Do you think that she's talking about this kind of rich, which means a lot of money, or this kind of rich, which means a lot of flavor? So, right. So this is a rich food. This is the kind of rich you are if you have a lot of money. So, rich in the story means food that contains a lot of butter or fat or oil. Something that would make him gain a lot of weight, right? Because she was trying to make him plump. But rich can mean a lot of money or wealth. Some people, this is only one version of it, but sometimes you could see it like they'll say rich and it's got a lot of bling, a lot of necklaces, a lot of jewelry, those kind of things, or fancy cars. I think of when I think of rich. So I want you to think about how you can use these words in a sentence. And go ahead and turn and talk to mom or dad or somebody that's there with you that you can use as make a complete sentence and talk about the word rich. Okay. So today's learning goal was I can orally compare and contrast similarities and differences between the witch in Hansel and Gretel with the witch in Rapunzel. They were very different. Go ahead and talk to mom and dad about that. Thanks for joining me today. And I look forward to seeing you next time when we read the story Jack and the Beanstalk, Part 1.